Hello. Welcome to the WikiCulture and Community 7, History of Wikipedia. We have two presentations here. The first, which is going to be a little bit longer than the second, is 11 Years of Wikipedia, or the Wikimedia History Crash Course you can edit. And that's by Guillaume
Paumier.
Guillaume Paumier. And then David Goodman, DGG, is presenting on the end of Notability. And since there's only two presentations, the first one's going to take a little bit longer, and then the second one's more of a discussion, I understand. Oh, it's a presentation, and so we're going to split it up into about a 50-minute chunk and a 30-minute chunk. Yeah, so I'm going to hand it off.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Should I speak close? Okay. So I'll do that. Is it better? Okay. So please come in. There are some seats over here or over here. Just make up your mind. So my name is Guillaume Paumier. I work for the Wikimedia Foundation, but this presentation is done as a volunteer. So today we're going to embark on a journey through 12 years, actually, of history, and 11 of them are Wikipedia history. Just before we begin, I'd like to get an idea of how experienced you are, because I'm guessing that many of you know more about Wikipedia history than I do. Who here considers themselves an active Wikipedian or an active Wikimedian? Okay. And who joined before 2005? Okay, so you know more about Wikipedia history than I do. One last thing before we begin. You can edit this presentation. If you go to this page on Meta, Wikimedia History, you'll see a list of links of sources that I used to put together this presentation. And you will also find the link to the source code of the presentation on GitHub that you're welcome to fork and improve. And please do. Because I probably left a lot of things out of the presentation, and there may be things that are just wrong, so please edit this presentation. So the format for the presentation is basically this whole timeline, which is split into a variety of subjects. If you can't read, that's normal, because we're actually going to go through this document by zooming in and spanning the different years. So let's begin. Just going to go through the different topics to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about. So Wikipedia, of course. It will be a bit English Wikipedia-centric, but I've also included some topics about the general Wikipedia projects. We'll give some metrics about Wikipedia, and then also some information about Wikipedians and metrics about Wikipedians. I've included Wikimedia Commons because it's more closely related to Wikipedia than other Wikimedia projects, and also because I love Commons, which I consider it my home wiki. We'll give some metrics about Commons. I'll briefly mention the Wikipedia sister projects and the other languages. And the last few items. So MediaWiki, which is the software that powers Wikipedia. The operational infrastructure, so the hardware and the data centers, etc. Wikimedia, the movement, which will include the foundation and the chapters and volunteers at large. And finally, some items about press and public perception. This is probably the least complete line of the timeline. Because it takes even more time and resources to put together items in this line. But let's go back to our main topic, which is Wikipedia. So just imagine that we're in year 2000. So Bill Clinton is the president of the US, and Tony Blair is the prime minister of the UK, and Britney Spears is at the top of the charts with "Oops, I Did It Again." And there's an internet entrepreneur called Jimmy Wales who wants to create an encyclopedia online which is freely accessible to all. And he creates Nupedia. So the way that Nupedia works is very traditional. It's mostly composed of experts and it's peer-reviewed. And now let's jump to 1 year later in 2001. And well, Nupedia has had very limited success, to put it mildly. And so one thing that Jimmy Wales and Nupedia's editor-in-chief, Larry Sanger, want to experiment is to create a wiki to try and boost the production of content on Nupedia. There's a first experimental wiki, which is Nupedia's wiki, which is first created as an experiment, but it soon gets its own domain name at wikipedia.com because some members of the Nupedia's advisory board aren't really comfortable with a wiki being associated with Nupedia. So Wikipedia gets its name and its own domain name at wikipedia.com. And a few other languages. So the Wikipedia.com is originally in English, and then there are the German Wikipedia, which is created a few weeks after that, and the Catalan Wikipedia, and then some more later that year. So while there were about 26 articles created in Nupedia's entire existence, I think. So in Wikipedia's first year, there are the Wikipedia reaches both the 1,000 and the 10,000 milestones. And the first sister project is created in 2001 as well. It's not a content project, it's MetaWiki, which I guess most of you know. As for the software, so both Nupedia's wiki and Wikipedia were first powered by an existing wiki engine called UseModWiki. It was written in Perl. Its creator was Clifford Adams. It didn't use PHP or MySQL or nothing like that. It used a flat text database. And it introduced some of the elements of the wiki syntax that you're familiar with today. One specific thing that I want to highlight about UseModWiki is that it first used camel case. Who here doesn't know who camel case is? Okay, so camel case is, so basically in UseModWiki, when you wanted to create a page, you needed a link with at least 2 capitals in the word so that the software would recognize that as a link. So if you wanted to link to United States, then you would basically write United States in one word and capital U and capital S. So that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but if you wanted to link to France, then you would have capital F, the first letter, and then you would capitalize the last letter, which is E, which is a bit awkward, but it was the only way to have 2 capitals in one word. And that wasn't really convenient or appropriate for encyclopedia articles. So a few weeks after Wikipedia was created, Clifford Adams, who was UseModWiki's creator and also a Wikipedian, implemented a new feature in UseModWiki, which is called free links, and which is the ability to create links with the now famous double square brackets and without camel case. And that feature was enabled on Wikipedia shortly after that. Also in 2001, there was a university student called Magnus Manske, who was a Wikipedian and who wanted to, who had this kind of crazy summer project of creating a dedicated software for Wikipedia that would be more appropriate to the encyclopedia. his goal was to try and make it more performant, and he started that with PHP and MySQL as his framework. So he started that in summer 2001, I think, and he introduced some features like namespaces and special pages and watch lists that that we continue to use to this date. And that was in Wikipedia's first year. About the servers, or I should actually say the server, because in 2001 there was only one server powering Wikipedia. It was hosted by Bomis, which was Jimmy Wales' company, for-profit company. And yeah, there was only one server for the English Wikipedia and the other languages as well. As you can imagine, during the first year, the reactions about this obscure Wikipedia project in the corner of the interwebs were a bit skeptical. And this is one quote that I think summarizes the general feeling pretty well. And it reads, "It isn't clear, of course, whether the world needs another encyclopedia." And it's easy to chuckle at that kind of press articles, 11 years later, but it gives an idea of what people thought about Wikipedia back then. So that was about 2001. And so we've only gone through about 1/10 of the presentation, but I'm not going to spend as much time as I did for this one on the other years. But I really wanted to give you an idea of what Wikipedia looked like in its first year. Because while you may have learned some things about Wikipedia's infancy, you can also see that a lot of things that you're familiar with Wikipedia today were actually born or introduced during its first year. So 2002, I'm going to go a bit faster from now on, but if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. In 2002, there was the advertisement controversy. So Wikipedia.com was hosted by Bomis, which was a for-profit company, and there were some discussions about how to monetize, how to make Wikipedia profitable. And while there were still hypothetical discussions, they were serious enough to scare off a group from the Spanish Wikipedia, who decided to simply fork from the Spanish Wikipedia and create Encyclopedia Libre. Is anyone familiar with the concept of forking? If not, okay, who is not? Okay, so it's a concept which is pretty common in free software. And basically, when a group of people isn't happy with the way that a software is being developed by its community, they, because it's free software, they have the ability to take this project and replicate it, and then have the project go into the direction that they want. It's called forking. And because Wikipedia is under a free license, the Spanish Wikipedians could do the same. They took the content from the Spanish Wikipedia and they started another wiki separate from that. And that way, they would be they would ensure that their hard work wouldn't be monetized. And shortly after that, Jimmy Wales declared that there wouldn't be ads on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia.com was moved to Wikipedia.org. In 2002, Larry Sanger resigns because funding has run out for his position, and there is also the first user block, which was called a ban, but that was actually a two-day block. 2002, I'm not going to talk about the September 11 wiki, but it was basically a fork from the in memoriam pages from Wikipedia. And so in 2002, the first content sister wiki is created. It's Wiktionary. And basically from then on, all the Wikipedians who were saying that Wikipedia was not a dictionary had somewhere to send all the people who wanted it to be. At the end of 2002, there are about 50 language editions of Wikipedia, and all of them are still hosted on that single server in San Diego, which, as you can imagine, is having he's having trouble keeping up with their combined traffic. So in 2002, Lee Daniel Crocker starts to rewrite MediaWiki, which isn't actually called MediaWiki, it's still the PHP script. And it calls it phase 3. And yeah, he just hacks the code to make it more performant. 2003. We have the logo contest, which results in the puzzle globe being chosen, the one that, well, mostly the same that the one you currently know. Nupedia disappears after a server crash in late 2003, and it will not return. And we see the first portals on the German Wikipedia. It's the first, I think, according to the historical pages, is Portalrecht, which means law. We reached the 100,000 milestone early in 2003. And the German Wikipedians continue to innovate with the first real-life meeting in Munich. In 2003, we have 3 new sister projects: Wikibooks, Wikiquote, and Wikisource. I'm not going to go into details. Okay, so in 2003, we see some more features for Wikipedia software, like support for text formula, caching, which is really important considering that Wikipedia and its 50 editions are still hosted on that single server back in California. MediaWiki is actually named a MediaWiki in 2003. And the communities can start localizing the interface messages. And in 2003, there is the groundbreaking announcement that Wikipedia is actually getting a second server. But that's not enough, and around Christmas 2003, there is a server crash that results in a week-long outage. And that outage will result in 9 more servers being bought in early 2004. 2003 is also the year the Wikimedia Foundation was born. Yeah, so basically Jimmy wanted to have some independent structure that was not his for-profit company to deal with Wikipedia's operations, so he created the foundation in June 2003. 2004. Have I lost many people yet? No. Okay. So 2004, we see the first info boxes on the biology and chemistry articles. I think they're first called the taxo boxes, but since they're being used outside taxonomy, they're renamed info boxes. The arbitration committee is created in 2004 because Jimmy doesn't scale for conflict resolution. And we see the first did you know items on the main page of the English Wikipedia. We see the first informal groups of inclusionists and deletionists on Meta, the first Bandstars and Lowells, and the London meetup, which is believed to be the first international meetup, simply because there were people with different nationalities there, including Jimmy. 2004 is also when Wikimedia Commons is created, because it doesn't really make sense to have to duplicate all these pictures on each and every wiki. So Wikimedia Commons is created to have one central media library to centralize free multimedia content. So three new sister projects in 2004, Commons that I just talked about, Wikispecies and Wikinews. As for the software, so Wikipedia now has about a dozen servers, and one nice feature is that when you have several servers, you can balance the load on the different servers. So that's a feature that was added about that time to MediaWiki. And in 2004, the categories and templates were added. And that's actually a funny story, because on the English Wikipedia, for example, one day the users started to see categories popping up, and they were like, okay, so what's this thing, and how do we use it? If you think about how much the categories and templates are used today, you can try to imagine how they did without that for 3 years. And when they got the feature, they didn't really know how to use it. There was also what is called the big schema change, which is a reorganization of how the data is structured within MediaWiki. And that was also to improve performance. So after the Christmas crash, there were 9 servers bought in January and 30 more that year. And all the servers were moved to Tampa in Florida, because that's where the foundation was based, and the foundation was based there because that's where Jimmy was living. The first servers outside the United States were put online that year, and there were some caching squids in Paris. They have since then been retired, but yeah, the first servers outside the US were in France. As for the Wikimedia movement, in 2004, the first Wikimedia chapters are created. They are Wikimedia Deutschland and Wikimedia France. The community elects their first representatives to the board. And the developers, or actually the system administrators, create the role of stewards to try and offload some of the administrative tasks to high-power users. And in 2004, Wikipedia is blocked in China for the first time. I guess that says something about how Wikipedia was doing at the time. 1 year later, 2005, we have the now famous Sagenhaler controversy, and it's sort of the starting point of that BLP issue. So BLP stands for Biographies of Living Persons. And because Wikipedia is gaining more visibility, people who want to use or to abuse Wikipedia are seeing it's more visible to them, and Wikipedia is more visible to people who are mentioned on Wikipedia, and it's more visible to the press. So we start seeing these problems with biographies, and a lot of what's happening in 2005 for the software, for the policies, relates to that ambience of biographies issues. For example, at the end of the year, Jimmy starts an experiment to restrict page creation to is it registered users? Can someone correct me on that? Yeah, okay. So that's one of the first steps. I'm also going to explain the implications for the software shortly after that. The Germans continue to innovate. They organized the first Wikimania in Frankfurt at that time. And so this is for Wikipedians. And Wikipedians also start the Esperanza group, which will be disbanded 2 years later. It was sort of a prelude to a community of wiki lovers, if I may. As for Wikimedia Commons, we see the first donation of content from direct media. It's about 10,000 files, and it notably includes high-resolution photos of famous paintings. MediaWiki features. So these are the two main features added to MediaWiki in 2005. And they both relate to this problem of biographies. Check user is a feature to try and identify people who abusers with multiple accounts. And semi-protection aims to protect articles while still leaving the ability to edit the page to a large amount of people. More servers. You can remember that for 2 or 3 years, Wikipedia had like 1 or 2 servers. And in 2005, we're seeing a big increase in the number of servers. The servers in Tampa, in Florida, move across the street. And we also have 2 more data centers, one in Amsterdam, which is called CNAMS, and which is a caching center, and another one at Yahoo in Seoul. And the one in Amsterdam is, okay, I'm not going to say anything about that because I may be wrong, so I just won't. And the one in Seoul has been retired, I think. Okay, so there are still servers in Amsterdam, but it's been moved since then. Thank you. About the Wikimedia movement in 2005, we have the first formal fundraiser. So the foundation had raised money before that to buy servers, but the first formal fundraiser happens that year. It raises about $100,000. And at the same time, the foundation gets its tax deductibility status in the US. And this is okay. So there's a T just outside the screen. Wikipedia is still very controversial at the time. And this is a quote from a French journalist who qualifies Wikipedia as being tangled up with false ideas, lack of rigor, and badly digested metaverse. And this is one of the nicest things that have been said about Wikipedia in France about that time.
It's also self-referential. It is a bad digested metaphor.
And but there are also some good things that happened in 2005, notably the 2 awards, the Ars Technica Award and a Webby Award. And at the end of 2005, there's the Nature study, which compares a selection of articles between Wikipedia and Britannica. I think it was about 2,000 articles, 2,000 scientific articles, and the study finds articles to be of comparable quality. 2006, 1 million articles, yay. And about 40,000 active Wikipedians. Active is more than 5 edits a month.
Only men?
No. This is the neutral person symbol. I mean, have you noticed how the symbol for women is like a man with a cape, like? So this is Wikimedia Commons. They have about 3,000 active editors, and they reach 1 million files. We have 2.5 new projects in 2005. No, this is 2006. We have Incubator, which is an incubator for new projects, Wikiversity. And there's also Wiktionaries, which is sort of accepted by the Board of Trustees to run as an experiment on Wikimedia servers, but that won't really happen. And Wiktionaries will become Omega Wiki, which now exists outside Wikimedia projects. 5 million articles in all Wikipedia languages combined, and that's about 250 languages. And you'll see that these days, I think we have 270 languages. So we had about the same number back in 2006. Okay. More servers and network equipment. So you see that now we're buying more and more servers to keep up with Wikipedia's growth. At the end, or probably actually at the beginning of 2007, Time chooses you as the person of the year, which highlights the fact that people on the internet are more starting to become content producers and not just content consumers. Okay, next year. Wikipedia 0.5, so that's announced by the foundation in 2007. It's a city of 2,000 sort of stable articles. And then we see the start of what we call the Eternal September. Is anyone not familiar with this term? Okay. Okay. So it's a term that's from Usenet, I think, and basically at the time of Usenet, there were university students were the okay. Let me try to rephrase that. Every year, when the university students would begin, they would get internet access that they didn't have before and that they were getting because they were going to university. And so every time, every year around September, the Usenet community was seeing, that flow of new people coming to Usenet who had no idea what it was and how it worked and what the rules were, how to engage with people, etc. And at some point, more and more people gained access to internet, and so it was not only once a year in September that this phenomenon was happening. It was just all the time. Yeah, Sumana?
Specifically, it's when AOL gave their members Usenet access. That was the September that never ended.
Okay. And so the same phenomenon is happening on Wikipedia around that time. So basically, before that, there were not enough people coming in to disrupt the community, and around that time, that's starting to happen, and that's when we see that the Wikipedia community starts to add anti-vandalism scripts and boilerplate communication just to be able to keep up with so many people coming in. And 2007 is around the time that we have the peak in number of active Wikipedians, and after that it starts to decline. But I guess that you've been hearing that for the past 3 days. As for the Wikimedia movement, yeah?
Is that all Wikipedias, all the projects?
No, you mean this one?
Yeah.
No, that's only for the English Wikipedia, because the trend is mostly visible on there. Okay, so 2007, the Wikimedia Foundation creates an advisory board. We have also the licensing policy, which is passed by the board, and the EDP, which basically allows projects to have fair use like policies. The Wikimedia Foundation defines its mission statement and its vision, and Sugarna comes on board. Another nice quote from a French journalist or whatever, who predicted that in 2 years from 2007, Wikipedia would have left as indelible a trace as Hula Hoop, Tepaz, and Jova 4. So I have no idea what the last two are. But on the other hand, I guess that no one knows, no one actually remembers who this guy is. So. All right, 2008. The German Wikipedia continues to innovate with the flag drives. Does anyone not know what flag drives is? Okay. I'm sorry? Okay. So it's a feature added to the software that adds a layer between the modification of the page and the time when you can actually see the change. So you have an editorial control between that. Wikimedia Commons gets more and more complex interface. I don't know if you've ever seen a brand new MediaWiki installation. You see that it's really simple to upload a file. You basically choose the file and you press upload. But that doesn't really work for Wikimedians who want like categories and descriptions in a gazillion languages, and who want like a dozen licenses. So the interface on Commons is getting more and more complex. The Wikimedia Foundation relocates to San Francisco in 2009. We had the license change. So until that time, most of the Wikimedia projects were using the GFDL as their main license. But as you know, it's not really convenient if you want to reuse the content. So there is a big vote from Wikimedians to choose to dual license the content of most Wikimedia projects under GFDL and Creative Commons. There's also the famous Scientology arbitration, which results in basically everybody being banned. And then we have, for the software, the usability initiative, which is the first real effort in trying to actually improve the usability of the software. It was funded by a grant from the Stanton Foundation, and it resulted in the vector skin and the wiki editor. 2010, 2 years ago. So as the interface of Wikimedia Commons is becoming more and more complex, there is another project, another usability project that results in the upload wizard being developed, and an illustrated tutorial to explain copyright to all the newbies. And as the one who actually led that initiative, I can tell you that it's really difficult to explain in a comic format what copyright is in like 30 seconds to someone who has no idea. But at the same time, Commons continues to grow. It reaches 8 million files in early 2011. Knowing that, I think never mind. And then the foundation starts to embark in the now famous editor engagement features, like article feedback and Wikilove and Moodbar and feedback dashboard and all the other ones that you've been hearing about. All right. There's a big outage in 2010 that results in a 1 hour global outage or something like that. And the new data center starts to being built out not far from here. Last year, 2011, the now famous Wikipedia blackout on the Italian Wikipedia, the first of its kind. Sorry, that got cut off. There's also the celebrations for the 10th anniversary of Wikipedia. The now famous controversial content with that basically the issue of sexually explicit images on Wikimedia Commons. I'm going to go very quickly through the rest. Wiki loves monuments. I'm just going to skip that. Wikimedia Labs, an effort to engage volunteers into how Wikimedia sites are run and to empower them to be involved in that. The Wikimedia Foundation expands its programs to not only running the site but trying to educate people to have the Catalyst programs in India and Brazil and etc. And I love this quote. I think it was first given by Sue, and she had heard it from a French journalist again. And it was making fun of Wikipedia is so 2007. And well, I mean, when you see the other quotes that I put up there, the reception and the public perception of Wikipedia really has changed over the years. this year, well, the now famous super blackout, I guess you've heard about that. 4 million articles since yesterday. We have now about 32 active editors, which basically brings us back to 2006. As for Wikimedia Commons, we're hoping to see some more participation, notably through the mobile apps. We are at about 14 million files on Wikimedia Commons, and we're currently in the process of having our latest sister project in like 5 years or so. We moved to Git. We are working on the visual editor. We deployed web fonts to have better internationalization. Whatever. The Wikimedia movement is trying to find itself and how to spend their money and how to organize themselves. And now what? Well, now we're going to transition to that new data center as soon as possible. We're also working on a new data center on the West Coast. We have a lot of nice features coming up, and Commons is going to get some more video soon. I'm just going to, yeah. So I guess I'm out of time.
You have about 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, 5 minutes for questions.
And we'll run the mic around.
Ray.
Just a couple of little comments about the early history. Among the earliest servers...
There's a microphone right behind you.
A little note about the history. Among the earliest servers, there was an attempt to have them all named after famous encyclopedists. But of course, as the number of servers got so big, I think that was abandoned. There was also a discussion that reflects on what's happening today about the gender gap, and that one of those earliest servers should be named for a woman encyclopedist. The other thing that I would comment on is, since I had something to do with the earliest incarnations of the taxo boxes, that was not the first attempt. The first was by Maverick 149 on the chemical elements.
So please edit the meta page to fix that.
I'd like to purchase a paper printout of this, suitable for hanging on a wall. Can you make these available?
Yeah, so let me go back to this. So if you go to this page on Meta, Wikimedia history, sorry. There's a link to this file on GitHub, and you can get the SVG and edit it and export it to PDF or whatever to print it out.
I just want to tell you that Chinese Wikipedia has arrived 500,000 articles today.
Yes, I'm user Graham 87. I've done quite a bit of work on the early history of Wikipedia. I've imported edits from the Nostalgia Wikipedia, which is the copy of a database from 2001. The database schema change that you talked about happened in 2005, not 04. I remember it very well. And it caused a downtime on the English Wikipedia of about 2.5 days. And also at the time we changed from, the English Wikipedia changed from ISO 8859 to UTF-8. So you could use an awful lot more characters.
All right, so then please fix the presentation.
I'd just like to send kudos to Guillaume for being very brave, telling Wikipedians their own history. As you can see, So thanks for doing this. This is amazing.
Thank you.
There's time for a couple more questions or comments, if there are any.
I'm user Maximilian Klein. So I looked at the, just as you were presenting the editor numbers and looking at the downtrend of the, and listening to Sue, so I just calculated that if we continue shrinking at about 4.5% per year, that there would be, it would take till 2160, year 2160, to be less Wikipedians worldwide than attended this conference. So thanks for showing me the statistics.
When will we finally be rid of them?
Any more?
I'll just say, if you're particularly interested in the history of Wikipedia, there's been a couple books that are out there, so just search on your library for it. It's really interesting. I think one was actually written by Phoebe, who was at the meeting this morning. So go to your library, check it out.
Yeah, and Andrew Lee's book is also really useful about that topic.
Does anyone remember the Encyclopedia Britannica official who had a quote that you would want to read a roll of toilet paper in a public bathroom, something like that?
I'm just curious what program you used to make this presentation.
Inkscape. So the presentation is basically an SVG file, and I'm using an Inkscape plugin called Sozi to animate the presentation with JavaScript.
One more.
Is there any particular significance to the letters on the globe symbol?
So I think that there was supposed to be the letters representing the first syllable or the first phoneme of Wikipedia in different languages, but there are probably other people in this room who can answer that question better than me.
Anyone have an answer?
Ting?
Yeah, it's mostly the character for W in different languages.
For W. So thank you very much.
Thank
that
you.
was an excellent presentation. So our next presentation is going to be by David Goodman, and he's talking about the end of Notability, I believe. So
I'm going to discuss really only English Wikipedia and mainly the present-day situation, with some glimpses at what I know happened since I joined, which was in '07. When I joined, I was rather startled by the amount of content in Wikipedia on things which I considered completely absurd to have on a encyclopedia of any sort. But as I started writing in the fields I was interested in, and other people started challenging lists as being too, let us say, technical or academic for an encyclopedia, I moved to what is essentially my current standard, which is that if I want what I think is important to be in Wikipedia, in the encyclopedia, I need to tolerate whatever anybody else wants to include in the encyclopedia. And this worked very nicely as my general idea until about a year ago, when we started being well known and famous and began being used as the main current worldwide advertising medium. And since then, I have been mainly working on trying to convert the flow of advertising into articles. I became an administrator in order to try to rescue articles that would be otherwise deleted. And in 5 years, I've rescued 500 articles. In 5 years, I have deleted 15,000 articles. So nothing about Wikipedia is really final, which is in fact how we've gotten here and have kept going in spite of all predictions, and there is really a tremendous tolerance for different ways of doing things. Part of the result of this tolerance is that we have a set of policies and guidelines which is self-contradictory and ambiguous to the extent that in most discussions I could perfectly well defend either side of the issue with equally good arguments based on policy. And since I'm concerned so much with notability, I called my talk The End of Notability, and I realized 2 days ago that that means two different things. First, the purpose of notability, what it's intended to do, and second, what I was originally going to talk about, why the concept is possibly obsolete. Certainly why I think it is obsolete in terms of the way the English Wikipedia uses it. Now, the end purpose of notability, which has been said by others, is to give users the confidence that we're an encyclopedia. The words in italics are in italics deliberately to mean that these are ambiguous words with multiple interpretations and that the meaning of the concept or the sentence depends entirely on how you choose to interpret that particular word. And there's going to be a lot of italics. What we mean by that usually, or certainly meant in the beginning, that we would be in some ways, both in content and in format, similar to familiar encyclopedias. In the English language countries, this means primarily the Britannica, which everyone was raised with in school and which has had various changes of its own about arrangement and coverage. But the standard thing in a printed encyclopedia, and which is intrinsic to any printed encyclopedia, which does have to have a finite size, is that it includes only the culturally significant subjects, whatever is viewed as that at the time, and this depends on the purpose of the printed encyclopedia, and encyclopedias at different periods have had very different purposes this way and very different ideas of content. But they always also do not really include advertisements for other than supplements to the encyclopedia and similar things. And they do not normally contain directory information, which changes much too quickly to be included in any printed encyclopedia, even with annual supplements. And people have always looked elsewhere for those sorts of material. So this is what people accepted, and this is what basically we over the years have been trying to build. Now, there's a theoretical connection between them, and I do not remember who said it, but someone said it better and much more elaborately than I am going to, that the purpose of the concept of notability really is to remove promotionalism, under the assumption that it is the insignificant and the trivial subjects which are the ones that are overwhelmingly more likely to be only useful for promotional or advertising purposes, and that this limiting the encyclopedia in this way automatically makes it not a directory of products and services. And I think that is by and large, in fact, generally correct and still doesn't hold. Now, notability in the English Wikipedia has some formal definitions, and the only reason I'm projecting anything today, which I ordinarily don't, is because I want to have the formal definitions out in front to look at. Quoting from the formal definition on the notability page, article topics must be notable or worthy of notice. Worthy of notice is the term I use. This definition is both circular in a way and also has that keyword worthy in there, which means whatever you want it to mean. And it also goes on to say the extremely self-contradictory statement that notability does not necessarily depend on fame or importance or popularity, which is what anyone naively would think was more or less meant by the meaning of the word, and which we tend to use to eliminate those articles which we don't think are significant enough. It is singularly difficult to explain to newcomers. And since this is recognized as not giving any particular basis for doing anything, we also go on to say that a topic is presumed to merit an article if it meets the general notability guideline and is not excluded under what Wikipedia is not, which is a policy I haven't written out in full because it is rather on the long side. So essentially, everything can go in as long as there's no reason to keep it out, if it meets the general guideline, which at the moment in the wording in the English Wikipedia, and it's been fairly constant, there's been less tinkering with it than some other guidelines, means that a topic has received significant coverage in reliable sources that are independent of the subject. None of these is obvious in terms of what it actually means or how it solves any given situation. The guideline page goes on to say that significant coverage means that sources address the subject directly in detail and are more than a trivial mention. I've abbreviated some of this because it goes on for paragraphs. The directly in detail, this is a change since '07. In '07, when I started, it read is primarily devoted to the subject, which is a much, much stronger requirement, requiring a book or a newspaper article actually about the subject, and there were discussions at the time which required the subject to be mentioned in the title of the article. Okay, reliable means that sources need editorial integrity. I think the usual wording is editorial supervision to allow for the verifiable evaluation of notability. This is trying to get the principle of verifiability, which is a much more fundamental and basic and necessary principle in on it. There's a couple of paragraphs in the text trying to make the connection. In detail is another rather tricky sort of thing, because how much detail a newspaper article discusses about something and a book about a biography, say, discusses is very, very different. But more than a trivial mention, which again is a term which is pretty clear in the extremes. Something like saying someone is going to give a musical performance at some particular venue on Friday, being counted as a trivial mention by almost anybody's standards, and where you go up from there varies. It is accepted that sources and Compass publish work in all forms and media. It is accepted that they can be in any language in any of the Wikipedias, or at least in the English one. Both points are continually challenged. And the question of just which media is accepted has varied over the years. In '07, we did not accept blogs of any sort whatsoever, but this is before newspapers began publishing most of their material on things which they titled blogs. And it now basically, in the reliable sources policy and dependent guidelines, means that basically it means editorial control, but it means something where there is some reason to assume, other than the statement of the person writing it, that it might be true, but at this point it accepts self-published statements by experts. And the discussions in any practical discussion on deletion of an article almost always hinge on the question of whether the sources are sufficiently reliable and independent. This is 90% of the time the disputable issue, and since there is no fixed standard, you can, as I said, argue them usually either that they are sufficiently reliable or that they are not sufficiently reliable. And everything which I would automatically think of as the most reliable things have, like Directory of National Biography has been challenged, and some of the least reliable things one can easily imagine have sometimes been accepted.
What kind of aspirin do you like most?
In what sense? Oh, why, how?
To deal with these interminable.
Oh, there is a solution for that, which I am going to give you on the next screen. The way to deal with the interminable things is that the discussions last for 7 days. And unless no one comments at all, usually finish at 7 days, and there's a 7-day appeal period on the English Wikipedia. And when I came in 2007, you could, however, bring it up again any number of future times with the usual result that if you brought it up enough times, it would eventually be deleted. I think the record is something like 13 or 14 times. At the moment, without any change in the guidelines, it is accepted that more than once every 6 months is not a good idea. And this is an example of what we all know, that in practice, whatever we say in the guidelines, what matters is what we do with the guidelines. So this is the basic criteria, but first, in a part that is almost totally ignored, it means that this is a necessary requirement, but even if it meets the requirement for an article, that you may best cover it in some other way. This is sometimes argued, but the net result is things that otherwise would not be covered in an article in any reasonable way, like individual characters in television dramas, if they meet the requirements, usually are defended as being appropriate for separate articles. And in one of the first AFD discussions I ever engaged in, I gave the argument when there were enough sources, but it looked ridiculous. Why do we have the guideline unless we're going to use it? And it was accepted as an argument. I don't think it would be today. And I don't think I would argue that today. The various parts of not. The key one, and the only one that actually means anything, is that Wikipedia is not an indiscriminate collection of information. We do not list every building in the street, for example. We do list every building in the historical register, and now comes the debated question of whether we list every street in the city, which has gone both ways over the years. And
the answer is no. I've been hounded for...
No, at the moment. I wouldn't count on... none of these interpretations, except at the extremes, is likely to remain stable. And if a particular street is considered important enough, etc. Because there is, after all, the basic principle that we can ignore any rule if we want to. Now, which I'll get back to, there's also subject-specific guidelines. The best established one which I helped establish soon after I joined, was on faculty and academics, where it was recognized that they usually do not show up in any biographical coverage, on any reliable biographical coverage other than a who's who, until after they're dead, when someone writes a decent obituary. And it is accepted as being an alternative to the guideline. Some of these guidelines are accepted as alternatives. Some of them are accepted as limitations, that it has to meet both the general and specific guideline. Both are argued for every guideline in the list, that it's an alternative or that it is an additional requirement. And some of them are clearly one or the other. Academics are clearly one or the other. Films and music are not one or the other. If you can show sufficient references to it, it will be accepted anyway, but otherwise, if it doesn't have a suitably high charting position, it will not be accepted as an additional guideline. whether or not to accept the special guidelines in some cases becomes questionable because they are generally proposed by special interest groups. The most recent example is the athletes guideline, which was proposed by the athletes people and in different ways some of it has been accepted and some has not been accepted. There is an ongoing dispute over the notability of articles involving people's famous Twitter feeds and whether we should have a specialized guideline for this. The real guideline, as I said, is that something is notable if we want to include it. And this is all that it means. And notability means that it's something which we want to have an article about in the encyclopedia, and it's an operative word. And the problem here, which I forgot to really especially italicize, is we, because in Wikipedia, we and the consensus means whoever is interested in continuing to discuss the issue. And not just willing to discuss the issue, but willing to continue discussing it as it comes back over and over again over the years. And any number of things have been accepted or rejected because people on one side or another have lost interest or patience with discussing the subject, rather than that opinion has actually changed. So, I think the idea is pretty obsolete because of the imprecision of the guidelines, their inconsistency, the unreality in some cases that they don't match what seems to make sense, and because the basic dependence on sourcing is based upon a 10-year-old view of what are the standard sources to be expected of newspapers, of magazine articles, of books, of all of the paraphernalia that people were educated with, and this no longer represents the world in any respect, that there are some topics with a superabundance of sources, like popular entertainers. There are some topics with an extremely low number of conventional sources, like much of free software topics, and so forth. And what do we do to replace it? One thing we can do is simply argue article by article until the guideline changes, and this is what I am generally doing. And the reason I do not usually need aspirin is because if I lose one argument, I forget about it and go on to the next. I don't think I've ever appealed a decision, because there's too many new ones coming. Okay, the first basic sort of general reform is to make decisions not on the basis of sourcing, that we still need sourcing because if we don't have some verifiable basis to write an article, we cannot write an article, and this is always going to be true. But that we actually establish some way or other, if necessary by a vote or whatever, what the actual requirements are going to be. And the guideline in books at the moment is that 2 book reviews is sufficient. I personally don't think it's sufficient, but we can certainly decide this as a specific, figure out what number will count. For football players, we've decided that appearance on the field in a real international match is what counts. We could make it a higher requirement of appearing twice if we wanted to cut down the numbers or whatever, or we could accept the second-level teams, but we could decide this. We could decide this once and for all, and we would have very few things to debate about on this topic and could get on with working on articles. It also means going back to that idea that notability does not necessarily mean an article. The importance of having an article is exaggerated by the fact of the importance that Google gives to article titles, which they do not give to sub-article titles. If they were to change the algorithm and include sub-article titles, the entire framework of this, especially as regards commercial products and the like, would shift immediately. And it is not really true to say we are independent of their decisions and shouldn't take account on them, because we're interdependent with Google in practice, because their usability depends on the fact that if you look up a topic on Google, You will find worthwhile information on it because there will be something from Wikipedia high up on the list, and so on. So we're not in that we're interdependent at this point, and I think we'll remain so. But otherwise, we should, if something is worth talking about, we should then decide how much it is worth talking about. And we have, I note, except for some requirements like avoiding undue coverage of negative events and the like, no actual guidelines, enforceable guidelines for what is the content of an article. We only can decide on whether there should be one. We have no stable way, short of the elaborate procedures of an RFC, of deciding what should be in an article. I am not proposing any because I don't know if I could. The other possibility, which I raised sort of tentatively and stopped discussing because I was laughed down too much about it, but I've already been laughed down, so I'll keep saying it, is to have a Wikipedia supplement, which I call Wikipedia 2, though any name would do, for local, more detailed, less consequential things, for things that would have a full article in there, but just a mention or a name on a list in Wikipedia, and which would satisfy the inclusionists because any topic about which there is information could be included in one part or the other, and which will satisfy the deletionists because it will keep all of the relatively less important things out of the main encyclopedia. No, because, well, what it actually sounds like is Wikia. And where it is different from Wikia or MyWikiBiz or other such projects is in retaining what I think are the core concepts and virtues of Wikipedia, that our content be verifiable, that it have not be original research, and that it has a neutral point of view, none of which are the least bit needed in Wikia.
Why does this matter in the age of computer searching? Is it only an issue of the egos of the community?
It's an issue going back to the beginning of that unless there is some level of reliability, of apparent reliability in the source, no one will believe the content in it. Just like you do not believe the content in something which is overtly an advertisement. It is, in the last year or two, 1/3 of this has already started happening, which is the local wikis, which have been talked about during this meeting and elsewhere, which do take care of the problem of what to do about local content and articles on individual streets and all similar material. There are not very many of them yet, but there certainly can be very many of them, and they can certainly serve the same purpose if they continue under a compatible license. It doesn't solve the content for everything else, but it is the model of what I would propose on that. Things happen, they happen in unexpected ways, and that's sort of what I anticipate, unexpected things. Okay.
Surely there's an easy answer to this, which is we change the policy, because basically the issue is maintainability. We could have 20 million articles. We wouldn't necessarily have 20 times the number of admins and editors to be able to maintain them all.
Okay. First, if we don't have technical standards of a great degree of complexity, we do not require quite as much maintenance. But also, to the extent that we include a wider range of topics, we will have a wider range of people interested in contributing to them. But yes, this is indeed part of a problem, and a local wiki is only sustainable if there's enough volunteers to actually work on maintaining the local wiki. And this is true generally also.
We have about 3 minutes for questions.
I agree that, maintainability is one thing, but I think there's also something. Has anyone been to Everything 2 in the last decade? Just go there sometime and just see the article titles. Like, just not even, they don't have verifiability or anything, so that's key too. But just what they allow an article for, just that seems to hurt the credibility a bit. I'm for including things, but you just need a guideline as to what is an article.
Yeah, there are school essays. At the moment, school essays are removed from Wikipedia under an obscure provision of the categories for speedy deletion of topics which duplicate the superior coverage in a Wikipedia article. That is our only way for getting rid of them at this point under the rules, and it works very nicely. But yes, you do have this problem of trying to prevent unnecessary forking and unnecessary special. If you've worked on the academic program, you know the way in which students in the class will often produce articles on things that are much, much too specific to make much point in an encyclopedia.
Yes, I have a question. I have my students at the university do articles on journalists who have been killed while reporting, and it's interesting that of the journalists who are killed while reporting, 9 out of every 10 of them are local journalists. They're not international journalists, and so you get people from Pakistan. You get people from African countries, Mexico, and many of these come up for deletion discussions on SIG-Cov, not on reliability issues, but SIG-Cov. They've been killed, and that's the only reason they're up there, so we should just delete it.
On the other hand, an AFD recently closed on the basis that the only thing significant in somebody's life was the fact that he died. And the other material in his life was not significant, but the fact that he died during a terrorist attack as one of the terrorists, that he died, was significant. The arguments can be used in any direction that way. The problem with journalists is a special case that almost nobody writes about journalists unless they receive a major award or get killed in a dramatic way. And journalists are usually, therefore, very much undercovered in Wikipedia because of this problem of finding the appropriate sources.
And it has to do with diversity, too. What would you suggest I do?
What I suggest you do is work on the basis of what you can find sources for, not under what journalists you have. In other words, find whatever good sources you have and write articles about whomever the sources cover adequately. If anyone wants to discuss these things in detail, I will be here from 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. But I do want to emphasize that I am both trying to say what I think the actual situation is at English Wikipedia. I would love to discuss with some people tomorrow what it's like in the other Wikipedias where I have no first-hand knowledge. And I am not necessarily proposing my solution because this is exactly what I would advocate, and I have all the problems worked out. I certainly do not have all the problems worked out any more than Jimmy had all the problems worked out 11 years ago.
One quick question. What does it feel like to see what DGG says all the time?
It bothers it really bothers me because I am interested in trying to have people accept my view to the extent that they know what my view is and can argue for it themselves, basically. And there are 1 or 2 very narrow subjects where, not just me, where 1 or 2 people's opinion in practice is a gatekeeper. Mine are Hollywood performers. There is one particular editor whose opinion will usually be accepted as definitive in a divided case. Yep. And very good person, but in practice this gives him a veto. And this is not what a community project ought to be like.
My question is very similar to Chad's question about notoriety, specifically in sort of parts of the world like the Global South, which is sort of quite disconnected from from where most of the editors come from. And it comes up a lot, especially amongst African editors, that what passes for notable sort of articles in, say, a Kenyan context or a South African context, other editors disregard as not being notifiable.
Yes, I was discussing this with
how to get around that.
I was discussing this with some African editors 2 days ago. And part of the problem is that those sources which are available from those countries are not generally available even within the countries. There is another problem which I don't really like to mention, but I will, which is that the things which pass as reliable sources, such as newspapers in some countries, have a somewhat lower standard of reliability than they do elsewhere. Or, I mean, whether a newspaper, but this is true here too, whether a newspaper will report a press release as if it were a news event depends on the newspaper.
So we don't have any more time for questions because there's a plenary coming up, but DGG has already said that he's going to be at the unconference tomorrow to debate these issues as much as you want. So if you want to ask questions.
Actually, to discuss these
discuss these issues. So a big round of applause.